Disclaimer, this video will be about historical musicology at large, and I have already made many videos on specific cultures before, like ancient Greek, Mesopotamian, etc. Those videos contain the sources. Now, because this is a wide-ranging discussion about the field of historical musicology at large, I will be making many references to different cultures, and it would have been unrealistic for me to find all the sources and list them down here, every source that I've ever used in my entire channel's history. So if you want to know what my sources are for my statements on ancient Greek music, for example, you can go in my Epic Talking playlist, click on the ancient Greek videos, and you will find the sources in the pinned comment of those videos. Same for other cultures. Can historical music be reconstructed? This reaction will be familiar to those of you who watched my video on Mesopotamian music, or rather how little we know about the music of ancient Mesopotamia. And this sentence will become a recurring theme throughout this video. How little we know is often the name of the game in historical reconstructions, or I prefer to use the term approximations of ancient music. And this reaction is part of a bigger inside joke that I have, where I joke that after every historically informed approximation of historical music, the musicians have the ethical obligation to turn to the audience and go, to indicate it's not, a kind of, maybe. That basically contains within it the entire nuance, the academic and epistemic nuance, eternally missing in public discussions surrounding the reconstruction, or as I prefer to say, the approximation of historical music. If you leave it to Reddit, or if you leave it to YouTube comments, to people who don't necessarily study the field, you will tend to get either of two extremes. Either you will get people who are overly confident in our ability to recreate the music of the past, or you will have people who are overly cynical. I meant skeptical here, skeptical. To the point of being science denialists. Absolutely, without any form of critical thinking, just go around saying, well, it's impossible to know, it's impossible, there's no way to know, there's just no way to know. And both of them are equally wrong. For the first category, the people who assume that we must know, most often it expresses itself in a very common reaction that I have from time to time. Whenever I make a video talking about a historical form of music, you will have people going like, where's the music? Why don't you just play the music? Just play the fucking music. Why are you talking? Why just play the music? I just want to hear the music and move on. So those people demonstrate that they completely misunderstand how history works. To expect our knowledge of ancient Greek music, for example, to be so complete that I can just play a bunch of music and then you can just move on with your day going, okay, now I know what ancient Greek music sounded like. That's not how it works. Human language allows you to contextualize and render that performance more abstract by saying, by the way, this ornament we did here, we're not sure, it's likely, but possibly, here's the methodology that led us to it, it's possible, yada yada yada. The second category of people are those who are overly cynical.
I meant skeptical here, skeptical.
To the point of turning a blind eye to the evidence that we have. So there is a category of people who have seen that when it comes to history, very often the right answer is to say, we don't know. Epistemic humility, simply saying, hey, we just don't have any idea. Very often that is the correct answer. The problem is there is a category of people who take that way too far. They see that you're wise when you say that, so they just want to be wise all the time, and so they just say it blindly, and they just walk around going, we just don't know, it's impossible to know, there's just no way to know. And as I've said multiple times in previous videos, in order to say, for example, there's no way to know anything about what medieval music sounded like, you need to be ignorant of medieval music, because somebody with a minimal knowledge of medieval music would know that, in fact, we do have a lot of musicological treatises, we have a good understanding of their music, we have a solid enough grasp of the general framework of their music theory. They wrote about their music theory, they wrote about how they performed, they even wrote down how they ornamented vocals and etc. So to say that there's no way to know anything about medieval music is not wise or epistemologically humble. It's just ignorance. It's just blind ignorance that blindly goes for a philosophy of we don't know-ism, even when in fact sometimes we do know at least many things when it comes to the music of the past. So consider this video an exercise in nuance. What we're going to do in this video is explore the nuanced way with which the field of historical music approximation should be approached. Not falling into either of these two binaries, but rather asking questions like, Well, what do we know about ancient Greek music? What parts of it are attested? What is more likely? That is the way to approach historical reconstructions. So let's go through some key concepts. Okay, concept number one, and this is perhaps one of the most important. It depends on the culture. So many times I see people talking about historical music reconstruction, either just hand-waving it all as nonsense, it's all fantasy, it's all just guesswork and imagination, or people who are overly confident in our ability to reconstruct. Both of them tend to treat it all as if it's one monolith that applies equally through time and space, where of course it's not the case. Some cultures will naturally leave us with more evidence than others. For examples, cultures that wrote down a lot will naturally have a higher likelihood of leaving us with more evidence than, let's say, a nomadic culture that didn't write down that much. The Scythians, for example, people say, why don't you talk about what Scythian music sounded like? Well, because they didn't write down their music. We don't have their music, you know. They were nomadic steppes people. What can I work with? Sure, we know what instruments they use, so I can tell you what the noise of their music was at the level of the timbre of the instruments, but unfortunately I cannot tell you what the actual music that was produced with those instruments sounded like. It depends on a case-to-case basis. And so when people ask, are historical reconstructions of music possible? Can historical music be reconstructed? Well, if you want to generalize the answer based on most human cultures, then the answer is, by and large, no. Like, absolutely not. 99.9999999% of historical cultures' music cannot be approximated in any meaningful historical manner because the evidence just isn't there. The point is that that I gave you, it's a spectrum. It depends on the culture. What about Achaemenid music? What about ancient Greek music? What about Roman music? 700s Frankish music? What about 1100s French music? What about 1600s French music? What about 1800s French music? The field of historical music reconstruction cannot simply be viewed as this monolith where, can historical music be reconstructed? Yes or no? Just give me the answer. It depends. It is highly situational, context-specific, and culture-specific. And this is where I will have to be very open and honest with you. I'm one of the boring ones. I am one of the pessimistic ones. There is a whole spectrum of opinions when it comes to how much historical music can be reconstructed. And I know academics, I know colleagues of mine who also work in this, who are way more daring than I am, who are way more optimistic than I am, who, for example, will go, yes, we can do approximations of ancient Egyptian music. Of course, they do not claim that these will be perfect recreations. They claim they are approximations. I am so fucking boring that I even reject approximations of ancient Egyptian music. I'm so boring. I'm like so careful and conservative that I don't think you can even approximate ancient Egyptian music. And I'm open to disagreements here. Some people will say, no, we disagree. We think there's methodology. We could use maybe Coptic chants backwards and everything. I'm just not convinced by that at all. But I just have to let you know that this is where I stand.
Farya, could you make a Scythian song? Do we have any idea of what they played? Could we reverse engineer it?
The music is entirely lost to us, unfortunately. Most ancient music is lost, and a mostly nomadic civilization would naturally leave no traces.
Can you please try your take on what ancient Egyptian music sounded like?
That's not possible, unfortunately. Meaningful, historically informed reconstructions that can claim any amount of approximated accuracy rest on evidence, and in the case of ancient Egyptian music, we have virtually none.
Or maybe the Bronze Age Near East.
Evidence is unfortunately so scant regarding those regions in that time period that a deep dive is simply impossible. We barely even have enough data to talk about their music at the most surface level. With the Hittites, it's even less possible indeed, since we know even less. As for the ancient Iranian empires, we know nothing of the music of ancient Iran.
Can you do ancient Egyptian music, ancient Celtic music, ancient Assyrian music, ancient Berber music, ancient Hebrew music?
If by ancient you mean of the ancient world antiquity, then no, unfortunately, it's not doable like this one. Ancient Greek music is virtually the only attested tradition of the ancient world with sufficient data to create meaningful approximations of. The rest of the ancient world is silent to us, music-wise. Same thing with Sumer and ancient Mesopotamia. Not enough material to even attempt an approximation.
At the end of the day, the music of the Viking Age in Scandinavia will be forever lost to us unless by some miracle we find treatises describing their music, but that's not likely to happen. So their music has gone with the wind.
The reason I'm stressing this part is because right now this chapter is doing a great job at
dismantling one end of the uninformed extreme, overestimating our knowledge of historical music. And this chapter is doing a very good job right now at lowering those expectations and explaining to those people, hey, like, no, you can't just assume that we know. However, as I've explained in the intro of the video, there's also the other symmetrical extreme, which is people who think that we don't know, it's impossible to know, we have to admit, we just have no idea at the end of the day. And they just blindly say that without even knowing where the evidence stands. The reason I am stressing how cautious I am is to preemptively dismantle accusations from those bad faith people who in the latter parts of the video will portray me as overly arrogant. This guy thinks that we can recreate ancient Greek music. What an arrogant person to think he's figured it out. Well, I don't think I figured it out. All I'm saying is we have a body of evidence, and if you actually do engage with it, you will realize that we can actually reconstruct to some extent the general soundscape of ancient Greece in the broad strokes. And once again, I not only have interviews with experts in the field, I have sources, academic sources, dozens upon dozens of them in every one of those videos where I talk about what we know and don't know about ancient Greek music. So the claim that I'm just making empty, crazy assertions that are unscientific falls apart very quickly. Okay, so in the previous chapter and throughout the video, you've heard me now say constantly approximation, not reconstruction. So there is terminology that is central to understanding the field of historical music. There was a time, let's say in the 50s, for example, when the term historically accurate performance was used. The field quickly did away with that terminology because it's a ridiculous thing to claim, at least for any music from before, I'll be generous here, I'll say the 1700s. So to say that a performance is historically accurate is misleading, because it leads people to think, oh, it's accurate. Oh, it's accurate. So that's what music sounded like back then. No, you cannot claim that ever, that a performance is what music sounded like at a certain point in the past. What you can claim, however, is that the performance that you have created is constrained by and informed by the evidence. This performance that you are hearing, it was informed by the evidence that we have, historically informed. However, because the evidence we have is incomplete, we cannot claim that the performance holistically is accurate. We can claim that those elements are accurate. We can isolate elements and definitely say those are accurate, but then that is more speculative. We know less about that, and etc. So an entire performance can never be called accurate. This is why the term historically informed is preferred. The second thing that the usage of the term historically informed does is that it automatically dismantles the bad faith people who approach the field of historical reconstructions in bad faith. There is always going to be in the comments of my videos or somebody else's videos, people who go in saying, wow, how arrogant of you to think that you've recreated the sound of insert culture. History is full of unknowns and they just start lecturing at you the epistemic humility that you have already shown by stating all of the caveats, all of the asterisks. Unfortunately, some people, they will see somebody post a historically informed rendition of ancient Greek music and they think, oh, he's posting that, therefore he must believe that this is exactly what ancient Greek music sounded like. That's not what anybody does in the field of historical, academic, scientific historical reconstructions. A lot of people are unfortunately dismissive towards the field. They dismiss the field of historical music thinking that people who engage in it think they've recreated the music of the past. Nobody who does it in a serious or academic or scientific manner believes they've done so. What they believe is they have approximated the sound to some level.
Because we're not talking about exactly how it sounded. That's just the point I'm trying to make. We're saying, given the indications, we can make a justifiable recreation. We can make a feasible recreation that wouldn't perhaps be vastly dissimilar to how it was performed in its time.
Capella Romana has gotten a lot of flack from, sort of both sides of the equation when it comes to Byzantine musicology and other kinds of historical musicology. When we branch out into other kinds of music, I was, well, you don't know it. It sounded like that. Well, of course we don't. I mean, the earliest recordings from the early 20th century, of course we don't.
And this is where we get to my favorite term. I told you that I am way more anal and way more conservative. The field has settled on the term historically informed reconstruction of music. I vehemently reject that term. Reconstruction? Buddy, you haven't reconstructed shit. You have approximated. I know what they mean by reconstruction, and the problem is what they mean is approximation. When you call something a historically informed reconstruction, like just the way that it sounds, people will hear reconstruction, and the way that it's interpreted is, oh, so it's a reconstruction. They've reconstructed ancient Greek music. No, they've approximated. So the idea is not, here is the sound of the Middle Ages. Rather, we have evidence, some evidence about the music of the Middle Ages. There are things that we know. We know enough to be able to put together a coherent enough performance that can give us an idea of what a performance of the Middle Ages may have sounded like in the broad strokes. In other words, we're not claiming this is what medieval music sounded like. We're claiming it would have sounded something along those general lines based on the evidence that we have.
Heilung doesn't try to make Scandinavian music, and they will readily admit that they try to offer a musical reconstruction of what might be tied to the time of Proto-Indo-European speaking cultures. It's fantasy, but in the way that an archaeological artist impression is fantasy.
Forgive me, but your comparison is utterly flawed beyond reason. An archaeological artist's impression is based on thorough research and the scientific method, and constrains itself to evidence and at most ethnographic cross-analysis to derive the most likely probabilities. Heilung uses throat singing because they heard other cultures doing it and thought it sounded cool. If you think Heilung is trying to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European music, you'll have a hard time explaining why they use the Tagol harpa from the 12th century and the Kravik lyre from the 9th, or why they sing in Old Norse. They're off by 3,000 years if Proto-Indo-European speaking cultures is their goal. If their goal is a reconstruction, then they are an utter joke. No, Heilung is comparable to a concept artist making up fantastical elven armor for Lord of the Rings out of creative freedom. An archaeological artist's approximation is not fantasy from creative freedom. It's a constraint-based, specialized approximation based on the scientific method. Comparing those two and calling them both fantasy is like saying Middle-earth and books on the Hittite Empire are both fantasy because our representations of the Hittites are incomplete due to lack of evidence. I remember there was a video that I watched a few years ago, and one of the comments underneath the video said, we have to respect historically informed performers. They may not make music with the head, but they make music with the heart. Nobody thinks that archaeologists sit around shedding tears of sentimentality and just basically letting their hearts dictate how they think the structure of Mycenaean palaces were. No, they understand that there's literal scientific methodology behind it. But for some reason, I think because music is so romanticized with this sort of artistic fluff around it, that people have a hard time conceptualizing music as anything other than sentimental artistic fluff. For a few years, I had a bunch of historically informed approximations of medieval music on my channel, and they featured the hurdy-gurdy. The problem is I made a very common mistake that's even common with a lot of very reputable ensembles where we use the sound of the chien. The chien is this component on the top of the hurdy-gurdy that allows you to do this zzz, 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 that rhythmic sort of buzzing sound on top of the drone and the main melody. The problem is those songs were from the 1300s and the 1200s, and the chien emerged much later at the end of the Middle Ages in the early modern era. And so what did I do? I nuked those videos out of existence. A bunch of videos with hundreds of thousands of views that, mind you, brought me a good amount of money because my videos are monetized, so they helped me financially also. I nuked them out of existence. I completely removed them, lost all the views, lost their algorithmic push that allowed them to gain even more traction and therefore make me more money. And I just re-uploaded them without the chien, with a disclaimer of the correction and everything. And many of them since then have not the same amount of views after years. So it's very funny to me to hear some people dismiss the scientific integrity of the field of historical music approximation by just hand-waving it all as, these people, they don't think with their head, They think with their heart. You know, the fact of the matter is, I was just walking down the street one day, and my heart told me to remove the shame from the hurdy-gurdy. Oh, what, you think I removed it because it's not reflected in the historical documentation and it's clearly an anachronism based on the evidence that we have? No. It's my heart that told me to do it. This is a passage from Stefan Hagel's Ancient Greek Music.
This sample is just sufficiently large. The average adult body weight of ancient Hellenic men has been determined as about 168 centimeters. We can safely base the calculations on this value, since a few centimeters more or less will not yield relevant pitch differences. From the given body height, we can extrapolate a forearm length between elbow and main finger joint of 36.9 centimeters. These 2 points are conspicuous on almost all representations. Based on these absolute figures, my measurements translate to an open length of the Kento Kithara string of S equal 43.4 centimeters.
This is him pouring his heart out. He wrote this book not with his head, but with his heart.
Margaret. The average adult body weight of ancient Hellenic men has been determined as about 168 centimeters.
How sentimental you are. Finally, a man not afraid to speak his feelings. Take me as your wife.
That's all historically informed interpretations are. A bunch of people who just work with their feelings. There's no evidence behind it. For some reason, the field of historical music gets this, frankly, incredibly infantilizing, patronizing, and condescending dismissal of its scientific nature. The field of historical music is no different from archaeology, from the history of art, from the history of theater, etc. All of those fields are about exploring limited evidence to the best of our abilities using norms of scientific standards and methodology. This is why the term historically informed is very important. As long as somebody understands what it means, they understand that it is not in fact fantasy just like Heilung, and it is not in fact feelings or the heart or whatever, no more than archaeology comes out of people's sentimental tears and hearts. I'm editing the video now, and I'm going to add this short chapter here. There's another fundamental concept that is key to understanding historically informed approximations, and it's the fact that approximations are made of distinct individual parameters, and not all of these parameters are going to be equally well attested. In the same way that a rookie mistake is to generalize all historically informed approximations as either accurate or not across time and space, as if Imperial China had the same level of records and documentation as Celtic Gaul in the 5th century BC, another rookie mistake is to approach an individual historically informed approximation of a specific culture and then ask, is the approximation accurate? Well, the problem is not every element within that culture is equally well attested. With some cultures, the vocal style may be better attested than how they played the instrument. When it comes to medieval, historically informed approximations of medieval music, more modern approaches to medieval music are now taking into account the fact that unquestionably medieval vocal styles were far more ornamented and modal than previously shown in previous recordings. It was a much more sort of systematically ornamented tradition when it came to the vocals. So the fact of doing ornamentations in the vocals is accurate when it comes to medieval singing, but how the ornamentations are done, that's where we don't really know. We know that they ornamented, but we don't know exactly how they ornamented in every single detail, in every single region, at every single point in time. So this is why one has to approach constantly compartmentalize distinct elements of an individual historically informed performance, not thinking in terms of, is it accurate or not?
The next concept is what I refer to as the spectrum of accuracy. Now, what is the spectrum of accuracy? People who are unfamiliar with the field tend to approach it as if it were a pure binary, that either something is accurate or inaccurate. But that's not the only options. Rather, what we are looking at is a spectrum of accuracy. On one end, you have things that are categorically known to have existed. Sometimes, when it comes to certain elements, you can absolutely claim this is historically accurate. When a historically informed approximation of Greek music uses the aulos, that's accurate. Oh, well, we don't really know history. You never know. No, shut the fuck up. We know they had aulos. We know they did because they talk about them. We have visual depictions. We found aulos in tombs. We literally have physical materials. We reconstructed them. We know the sound that they make. That is accurate. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things that are categorically known to not be true. We know for a fact that medieval Western music did not use the modern tonal Western system of chords and chord progressions because we know, we can literally trace how that system came to be born from the Middle Ages onwards. We literally see how gradually Europeans came up with it, and we have plenty of writings by medieval musicians who talk about their own music. So there are things that we know to be true categorically and things that we know to not be true categorically. So on the two extremes, there are accurate and inaccurate stuff. Sure, absolutely. But then there's a whole spectrum of likelihood. And we have things that are so goddamn likely that we basically don't even need evidence for them to assume that they existed. What would an example of such a thing be? Ancient Romans, when listening to music, some of them would clap their hands or stomp their foot. This is something that is pretty much universal to human beings. So if somebody does a historically informed approximation of ancient Greek or Roman music and adds within it, for added immersion, the sound of an audience clapping their hands, and somebody goes, oh, well, where's your source for that? Va donc chier, man. Va c'est des queues à Saint-Jérôme, tabarnak de colis. Now let me give you an example of something that would be moderately likely. Let's go to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, we know they had instruments that performed drones. Drones were a very big part of medieval musical practice. They would have the hurdy-gurdy, for example, where it was built to produce a drone. So you crank the thing and it does this continuous drone, and then you can play the melody over it, but it creates a drone over it. They also had bowed instruments, for example, that had bourdon strings. The bourdon were there to provide a drone. So you literally play some of the strings and the other ones are just there to provide a constant drone to accompany the song. It is categorically known that they had drones in medieval music, and it is categorically known that they had instruments that produced drones whilst playing a melody. But did they sometimes use instruments only to produce a drone? Could it be, for example, that they would take a vielle and just do a drone on it? Well, it's moderately likely, I would say. It's not the case that most cultures that have similar monophonic and modal traditions to medieval music will use one instrument to only do a drone. It's not like so present and ethnographically attested in other cultures throughout time that we can call it highly likely. But it does occur occasionally enough that it is moderately likely that at least in the grand scheme of things, in the 1,000 fucking years of the Middle Ages, with every village and here and there, probably some regional practices would have involved somebody playing a drone, using an instrument that can do something other than drones, that they would sometimes use it to only play a drone. And then we move to the later categories, unlikely.
What if the Norse had throat singing?
Yeah, technically there's a possibility the Norse had throat singing, and there's a possibility they fucking died. There is no throat singing tradition anywhere in Europe outside of Sardinia, and Sardinia is famously isolated on many levels. So when we find throat singing there, it's more likely that it is a unique Sardinian phenomenon than something else. Is there a living throat singing tradition in Scandinavia today? No. If there was, it would be likely that it existed in the Middle Ages. Is there a lot of throat singing around the world? No. Throat singing is very peripheral, is kind of an anomaly in the grand scheme of things. There's only a few pockets of the world where throat singing exists. It is possible the Norse had throat singing, sure, and it is possible that when doing rituals, they had a dab kind of move. That is also possible, but we're in the extremely unlikely territory now. So unlikely that it is basically of no seriousness, and it does not count as a theory. It just counts as random what-ifs thrown around. But I hope this example has helped you get a better understanding of how the approximation of historical music ought to be conceptualized. Not merely as, is it accurate or inaccurate? There's also a whole spectrum of likelihood there. Perhaps one of the most misunderstood points is that approximations of historical music deal with the concept of at what level are you reconstructing the music. I think the biggest misunderstanding that a lot of people have is that when a performance of, let's say, a medieval song is done, people, who roll their eyes and give a side eye and are very smart and skeptical about it and dismissive, they're like, oh, you really have the confidence to believe that this is exactly how it sounded like when it was played for this king, in that hall. And of course not. Firstly, that reaction reveals a profoundly modern Eurocentric bias. In the classical and post-classical era, what developed was what some people call the cult of the composer. The idea that the composer decides this is the melody and they write down the sheet, they write down exactly where the ornamentation happens. It's a suite for 2 violins and I want 2 pianos and 1 piano there. And then recording technology strengthens that impression. Now, songs have an original version and then there's covers. People talk about how, they say, oh, I like your cover of this folk song better than the original. I'm like, which original? It's a folk song. What do you mean, the first time that some peasant sang it, who knows, like 200 years ago? No, what they mean by original is whatever version they found first. But that is this is classical Western European post, 1700s ways of dealing with music. Most historical music, even in Europe, was historically not the case. I talk about that in this video essay. When it comes to medieval music or ancient Greek music, it's very well understood that all the notation did was give you the bare bones melody. That's it, the melody. Then you add your own ornamentations, and every time it would have been played differently. When Mesomedes was writing the hymn to Calliope, he wasn't thinking in terms of, I want 3 aulos and 1... No, you have a melody, and then that melody will be passed around, and circumstantially every time it'll be different. So what I think a lot of people get wrong is, you'll have a song like J'aime sans passer les durs by Guillaume de Machaut et Virlet from the 14th century. And they will ask, well, how do you know that Guillaume de Machaut performed it the way you did with a drum and a vielle and the lute? And how do you know that it was this tempo? How do you know that it wasn't just a solo bagpipe? I'm like, this is meaningless to people from the medieval tradition. Guillaume de Machaut would not have thought about it in those terms himself. It would have been meaningless to him. He did not have such a concept of the original arrangement. A single bagpipe playing that song, or the full ensemble that I did, both of them are equally valid because that entire range of performance would absolutely have operated. If you look at the folk tradition, that's how the folk tradition works. There's no one way to play a folk song. You have a margin of maneuver that is available. You have a margin of options that are accurate, that are acceptable, or at least highly likely or moderately likely, as we established. And within that margin, a folk song can be played a bunch of different ways with a bunch of different tempos. Modern folk music from England can be played with only an acoustic guitar or, with an acoustic guitar and an accordion, and both of them are valid. What we need to understand is that historically informed approximations do not try to recreate a specific individual situational performance. It's to create a performance that resembles as much as possible the idiom-wide language that would have been used back then. The example that I can give you is this. Latin can be reconstructed. Latin never really died. We never lost. We know how to form phrases in Latin. We even know how to pronounce sort of elite classical Latin from antiquity. You can learn Latin. When we speak reconstructed Latin or when we speak ancient Greek, the claim is not, well, how do you know that a Roman said that specific phrase word for word? Unless you can prove to me that a Roman specifically said, I am going to go to the bathroom, Marius, then it's not proper Latin. This is the stupidest fucking logic. I'm going, bro. This is the stupidest. It's such an idiotic logic. Yes, I don't know that a specific Roman person in the days of ancient Rome specifically said, I am going to go to the latrines now, Marius. But that's irrelevant. As long as you formulate the phrase in a way that does not contradict the grammar of Latin, it's not about making sure that those phrases were literally spoken word for word out of the lips of 2 people who existed. No, it's about formulating phrases that they could have spoken. When we take a Virlet by Guillaume de Machaut and we're performing it, we are not claiming this is exactly the sound that resonated throughout the French walls of this castle. What we are saying is this is an approximation of French music of that era of the Middle Ages at large. We're not trying to reconstruct what court music of this region specifically was in its local regional specificities. We will never be able to reconstruct that. But we can, to a degree, attain some level of approximation of what French music for around 400 years sounded like in its general framework. Approximations of historical music are always high level. They're never high resolution zoomed in. They're low resolution, they're big. You know what the best analogy for that is? Imagine a desert that existed in Pangaea. You know, back when the continents, there was like one continent, right? Scientists come in and they approximate what that location was like. And what they say is, well, it was a desert. Therefore, it was arid and did not have a lot of vegetation. That is a very different claim from them stating in that specific corner, there would have been a rock turned at 45 degrees and there would have been 2 lizards there at, 2 p.m. No, of course we can reconstruct to that level. People altogether throw the baby with the bathwater. They dismiss the entire field as entirely nonsensical because what they think people in it are claiming is that they have reconstructed specific situational instances of music. That is not what they're claiming. When we do historically informed renditions of medieval music, when we do historically informed renditions of ancient Greek music, what we are stating is, it was a desert, so it would have been dry, and there wouldn't have been a lot of green vegetation. And if people want to reject that as overreaching, the problem then isn't with the field. It's with people not wanting to understand what it is and what it's trying to do.
Okay, so now the question could be asked tangibly. What is the process? How do we actually tangibly render approximations of historical music? So I'm going to walk you through one example, which is Roman music. Can Roman music be approximated? The answer is yes, as long as we understand we are talking about approximation. We are not saying here we are going to revive the sound of ancient Rome. We know what Roman music sounded like. When I do approximations of Roman music myself, I refer to them as similar to a stickman figurine's resemblance to a human being. Is a stickman figurine a very accurate rendition of a human being? No. Does it have all the details and the fidelity of all the nuance and complexity of a human being? Of course not. But is it completely off the mark? No. If an alien species, for example, they wanted to know what humans look like and they got a stickman figurine, okay, it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. At least they know that we're bipedal. At least they understand, okay, that's a head and they have like 4 limbs and everything. How can we approximate? How do we know the outline of what Roman music probably sounded like? Well, the ancient Romans in their writings tell us explicitly that they utilized ancient Greek music theory. So we know that the Romans, for example, used the diatonic genus of ancient Greek music. Now, how do we know what the diatonic genus's modes sound like? Let's say the Dorian diatonic, a collection of 7 notes. Well, how do we know what is the actual intervallic measure of those 7 notes? The answer is thanks to the monochord. The monochord was a system devised by Pythagoras, and it's a very simple concept. It is a box. Let's assume it is 50 centimeters long. You have a 50 centimeter long box, and you have a string that goes all the length of the 50 centimeters. It is tied on both ends. Now you have a movable bridge underneath the string. The more you advance the string this direction, the more the string is tightened. And the tighter the string, the higher the pitch that the string will produce. Now what Pythagoras discovered is that if you bring the string exactly to the middle of the box, mathematically to the middle, you get the octave
of the original note, meaning the same note but at its octave.
See, I have the same note but an octave higher. Let's compare now these two notes again. See.
What Pythagoras thus discovered is that there is a direct relationship between the physical mathematical ratios and the actual note produced. The exact midpoint of the box equals the octave, and therefore they understood the fourth note of the scale therefore equals a specific place on the box, a specific measurement. So how do we know what the Dorian mode's notes were? Because the Greeks tell us using those physical measurement ratios. They tell us specifically the first note of the Dorian mode is when you have the bridge, completely on that side. And then the second note, you bring it at, let's say, 10 centimeters. They give us the notes of the Dorian mode using exact, precise mathematical ratios. And we know the exact size of the monochords that they used because, of course, the Greeks did not utilize modern systems of measurement. They didn't utilize units that we do, like centimeter. They had other units of their time, but we know what those units were. Why? Because they describe using those units buildings that still exist. They'll say stuff like the Parthenon is this number of units wide. Well, we have the Parthenon, we know how wide it is, so we can reconstruct exactly what they mean by those units. Okay, now we established the ancient Romans say they use the same modes as the ancient Greeks. So that's already a starting point. We know the sonority of their music in terms of what the sonority of their modes were. Now, how do we go on about reconstructing what an ancient Roman melody may probably have sounded like? Well, the best place, in my opinion, to start is with the poetry. We know that the ancient Romans sang their poetry. Now, the particularity of ancient Roman poetry is that it was intrinsically musical. What do I mean by this? Roman poetry was designed to benefit from the prosody of the Latin language. Latin had short versus long vowel distinctions. In Latin, you had the word malum and malum. Malum means apple. Malum means evil. Maybe I got them confused. They're literally the same word, the same sounds, the same letters. The only difference is one of them has a long a and one of them has a short a. Malum versus malum. Based on that vowel system, they then had a stress rule. Some languages stress certain syllables in the words more than others. For example, modern Greek. In modern Greek, you say Evcharisto. You don't say Evcharisto, you don't say Evcharisto, you say Evcharisto. But then some of the words, Corinthos. You don't say Corinthos or Corinthos, you absolutely have to say Corinthos. We know exactly which syllables the Romans would have stressed. So when you have ancient Roman poetry, the whole point of ancient Roman poetry is that basically it's rap. It's rap music. What it is about, fundamentally, is creating successions of words that, of course, have poetic meaning, but also create a musical, rhythmical sonority. You choose combinations of words that create nice structures of rhythm.
Vivamus mea lesbiat quamemus rumoresque senus severiorum omnes unius aestimemus assis.
What this means is every single time you are dealing with a piece of ancient Roman poetry, you are dealing with a musical outline. If we take just the first word of the poem Vivamus, we know which syllable will equate to a longer note, which syllable will equate to a shorter note, and which syllable will have the highest pitch of the melody on this word.
Vivamus mea lesbiat quamemus rumoresque sednum severiorum omnes unius aestimemus assis.
This is why I talk about the possibility of approximating Roman music. This is a workable level of evidence that allows us to get an outline of the sonority of ancient Roman music, similar to how a stickman figure is an approximation of what a Homo sapiens looks like. Do I know that the melody would have gone da na 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 na? I don't know that. So what I did when writing the melody was I looked at the extant compositions of that period, most of which are by Mesomidis. Mesomidis, in his compositions, he has the tendency to skip in intervals, so he likes large gaps between the interval of the mode. He likes big jumps. But it's possible that the Romans, instead of writing like this, they personally would have preferred clustering the notes together. I have to model how I write the melodies in the style of Mesomidis, meaning a lot of large gaps in the melody where I jump between very distant notes within the mode, because that's the only extant compositions that we have of the era. And it makes some sense. I mean, we know they were playing Mesomidis also in the imperial courts of Rome. Mesomidis' music was being played in Italy proper, but maybe it was seen as regional. Maybe the regional style of Romans was that they didn't do large gaps. We do not know to that degree. But we do have enough evidence to form an approximation. Is it a reconstruction of the sound of Rome? Of course not. Does it revive and let you know how ancient Roman music sounded like? Of course not. But it does give you a scientifically robust idea of something that probably would have resembled, in the broad strokes, what Roman music may have sounded like. This is why this chapter was very helpful, because now we are going to enter the chapter of what I like to call uninformed, unwarranted skepticism. So I would like to spend a few words now on a final chapter that I think is very necessary for the subject of this video, and it has to do with pseudo-intellectuality and fake intellectuality. A lot of people have talked about the fact that on the internet in recent years there is a movement of pseudo-intellectuality that has arisen. People who perform faux intellectuality without actually engaging with the reality of what intellectuality requires, which is critical thought, which is nuance and everything. Here and there I will always occasionally get people in the comments saying stuff like, well, there's no way to know. There's just no way to know. It's all guesswork. There is now a radicalization of epistemic humility, where some people have figured out that I don't know is a very mature and honest response to many historical questions. The problem is they're taking it too far, and now they're saying we have to say I don't know to everything. This is not science. This is anti-scientific thought. This is anti-intellectual thinking. Science is about recognizing what we do know and what we don't know, which is what I do on this channel. I am constantly saying we don't know what that music was, we don't know about this, we don't know about that. But when we do know, well, I will present it if we do know. I'm not gonna lie and pretend that we don't know just because it looks more humble. And the reason it's so, I think, seductive to a lot of people is because in order to say we do know what the ancient Greek modes were, well, you have to do a lot of research.
You see, it takes no knowledge at all in order to say blindly, we don't know anything, we don't know anything. It's very easy to just say that, and you don't need to know anything. In fact, in order to say that in the first place, you have to know nothing about the subject. Anybody who does know about the subject would never say that. On the other hand, in order to be able to say, well, actually, we can approximate ancient Greek music, you have to know very complex concepts. Imagine somebody who does not understand long versus short vowel distinctions. Imagine somebody who doesn't understand pitch accent. They know none of these linguistic concepts, therefore they don't understand how a poem written in ancient Latin already gives us an indication for a melodic outline of which notes are held longer and which notes go up or down. Similarly, in order to know how we know what the ancient Greek modes sounded like, you have to understand the concept of the monochord, that there is a string, that the more you tighten the string, the higher the pitch, that there are specific intervals. You have to know all of those complex concepts in order to convince someone that actually we do know a fair bit about ancient Greek music. They have to know about linguistic concepts, physical concepts, musicological concepts, acoustical concepts. People who do not understand any of these are the ones who act skeptical and go like, no, it's impossible. How can you possibly know? When they say, how can you possibly know? All they are saying is, I personally cannot conceive of how we know. I do not possess any form of knowledge through which I can imagine how we can know. Therefore, I assume that it is unknowable. When people blindly proclaim it's impossible to know, what they are doing is mixing their ignorance and thinking that their ignorance is a representation of objective reality. The psychology behind those people is very evident in two different reactions that I've encountered to some of my videos. Of course, those are two examples, but I'm using them as microcosms. So I did this video about how most medieval themed music in pop culture, which we call neo-medieval and bardcore, is not actual medieval music, and that medieval music functioned differently. And in the beginning of the video, I say this very clearly. I don't want to claim that we know absolutely everything there is to know about medieval European music. There's many places in which historical reconstructions of medieval music are speculative at best. Whilst obviously not everything is understood from the European Middle Ages, the general soundscape of the Middle Ages is very much understood because we have a lot of evidence. Then you have this Reddit thread where somebody links this video and they ask, what do you think about this video? And somebody says,
I'm not educated enough to comment on the quality of his descriptions and arguments. Is it true, though, what he's stating in his disclaimers, that we have such extensive knowledge about how European medieval music sounded? Well, it's absolutely fascinating to dream about what musical wild growth was around at that time that just was never recorded in any way. It also makes it a bit irritating to hear Faraji talking about medieval music like we have audio recordings of it.
And I respond to the main OP. I invite you to consider the fact that people on Reddit forums rarely respond to the actual videos and instead formulate straw men that they respond to. This person down here being quite a good example. He claims it also makes it a bit irritating to hear Faraji talking about medieval music like we have audio recordings of it. Meanwhile, I specifically say in the video that many aspects of our reconstructions of medieval music are merely speculative, and I specifically state that there are plenty of things we do not know. And yet here I am, accused by somebody of acting like we have recordings of medieval music. Somebody else writes, I don't know what these guys are on about. I find your vlogs like this one to be very insightful. And I respond, what's going on is that they're seeking to critique the analysis, which is fair in principle. But because the statements I make are the most musicologically uncontroversial, scholastic, banal, and well-established notions in the field, like neo-medieval music not functioning like historical medieval music, they can't actually produce a coherent critique without strawmanning, removing nuance, and distorting the statements of the video like this person does. The mentality of discussions like these can be summed up perfectly in this person's comment. He begins with, I'm not educated enough to comment on the quality of his critiques, but... and then proceeds to comment on the video on the basis of his incomplete knowledge, finishing with how frustrating my video is, and passing a definitive judgment on the video, completely forgetting he's not educated enough to comment. If he was educated enough, he would know that all the things I say about medieval music are known at a categorical level, not because of recordings, but because of the body of primary sources, musicological documents, essays, and theoretical treatises that were written down in the Middle Ages that we have access to. Any person even minimally educated on the subject of medieval music would not bat an eye at the confidence with which I speak of the overarching fundamentals of medieval music. It being primarily horizontal in nature, modal, ornament-oriented, a different harmonic language, because they would know that the writings that have survived are plentiful and detailed enough to let us know those things, and that an accusation of acting like we have recordings is utterly foolish in this context. It's the equivalent of saying, it's frustrating to see historians confidently claim Caesar was assassinated, and they're acting like we have video recordings of ancient Rome. That is the level of ignorance on the subject we are dealing with. Being so unfamiliar with the textual documentation of the era that when somebody presents facts, they assume they're pulling nonsense out of their posterior and implying only recordings could provide such knowledge. The introduction of the video clarified that there is a bibliography of sources in the pinned comment that can corroborate my statements on the knowledge we have of medieval music. See, the claim it's frustrating to hear Faraji talk about medieval music as if we had recordings
is the telltale of somebody so comically ignorant of even the basis of music history education. Because what I'm saying about medieval music in the video is, well, it was primarily modal, primarily monophonic. Their harmony did not yet function exactly like modern Western tonal harmony. They did not have block chords creating chord progressions. This is music history 101. This is the equivalent of going to a class on geology and the teacher says the earth is a sphere. Like, that's the level of, as I said in my reply, banal scholastic. But the most interesting thing is, the guy asks,
is it true, though, what he's stating in his disclaimers, that we have such extensive knowledge about how European medieval music sounded?
And in the beginning of the video, I say, I have the sources. Does the guy check the sources? No. He'd rather write on Reddit. Is he right? I don't know. He has sources by academics. I'd rather ask Reddit.
Now you have my last video essay about AI music, where I talk about channels that post blatantly modern music claiming that they are historical reconstructions of ancient Roman music. This song, for example. And I explain why this song absolutely does not resemble ancient Roman music, and that we know enough about ancient Roman music to know that it would have sounded more like this. And then you get this comment.
I agree AI gets it wrong and fuck AI, but it's all a bit vibes to try and play music before the Middle Ages. I really side-eye anyone saying that these recreations are authentic. This is not defending AI, but let's also not pretend that these recreations are totally factual either.
And then I respond,
but let's not pretend that recreations are totally factual either.
Which is not what I did at all, and why your comment is completely lazy and written in bad faith. I consistently use the term approximation in this video when referring to the informed approach of reconstructing music. Now, unless you're a moron who does not understand what approximation entails as a term, then you're utterly full of shit for coming here and implying that I'm saying we know everything about ancient Roman music. Anyone who actually watches this video attentively with good faith, aka not you, knows that pretending these reconstructions are entirely factual is not remotely applicable to this video. The stupidity of your rebuttal is encapsulated in the fact that we don't need to have all the details of ancient Roman music to know that it's not modern Western pop music. This video isn't focused on what ancient Roman music was, it's about what it was not, modern tonal chord progressions. When I say ancient Rome didn't have pop chord progressions, and your response is, well, let's not pretend we know everything about ancient Rome. Number one, that's not what I said. Number two, it's like saying, people claim Ice Age people in Great Britain didn't speak English. How do they know? We don't know exactly what language they spoke. I have stressed myself in countless videos that ancient Roman music can never be entirely reconstructed, but only that its general aspects can be approximated. And we do have enough information to allow us to do that, which allows us to state categorically that it was not modern pop music. Your entire rebuttal is a lazy, intellectually fallacious response built on turning my statements into straw man. When I say we have enough data to approximate the general features, you turn that into, well, let's not pretend we know everything.
And that to me is the telltale of the psychology behind those people. You see, when it comes to these kinds of pseudo-intellectuals, and I've had thousands of them over the years at this point, so I have a big pool of data to analyze, and there's always two consistent things that always show up at a systematic, algorithmic level. The first thing is, they always exaggerate the positions of historical musicology and strawman them into utterly absolute positions of certainty, whereas historical musicology never claims certainty. The problem is, you can't be the one who corrects people and brings nuance in the discussion when the people already bring the nuance in discussion themselves. So you have to pretend as if they're not nuanced so that you can then come in and be the heroic, smart person who actually brings nuance. This is why whenever historical musicology says, here are approximations, we're not sure, but they're, it would have sounded something like this, they always come in and say, well, no, you don't know exactly what it sounded like, when that's not at all what they said in the first place. Take, for example, the two videos that we just talked about and the responses that they got. In the first one, what do I say? I say, hey, there's a lot of things that we don't know about medieval music, but we have enough documentation to know its general features, And in that, we know that it wasn't modern bardcore music. And what is the person's reaction? Farya Faraji talks as if we have recordings, which to any person with a minimum of good faith is clearly not what I'm saying at all. In the second video, what am I saying? I'm saying these are approximations of Roman music that let us know that Roman music would have sounded more like this than this. And what does this person say? Let's not act like they're perfectly accurate, which once again, to anybody with a modicum of good faith, that is not at all what I am saying, not remotely. That's strategy number one. They always strawman historical musicology from its nuanced position that admits uncertainty and act as if it is an absolutist position of certainty so that they can be the heroic intellectual person who brings nuance back into the conversation. And then the second strategy that they always employ is to always negate the sources, never bring up the sources, never engage with the sources, and continue to act as if they're not there. Why? Because if they acknowledge that there are sources out there, they have to acknowledge that there are in fact ways of knowing about historical music that they don't know about and that they simply have never even bothered to study them and analyze them, which reveals them to be actually just ignorant people who shouldn't even be having an opinion in the first place because they simply know nothing about the subject to begin with. Let's once again take those two videos and the reactions to them. In the first video, at the very beginning, there's a text on screen that says, look at the sources. I have plenty of sources that will corroborate what I say. And what does the person do? They don't look at the sources, rather they just go on Reddit and say, is it true? Why are they asking to Reddit if is it true? Why are they not looking at the sources that I provided? They specifically avoid looking at the sources that I provided because that way they can maintain this artificial sense of uncertainty that can allow them to look smart when they say, we really have no idea and we're only dreaming about medieval music and there's nothing that we know about it. Similarly, in the second video, I have a similar text that says, when I make statements about what we know about Roman music, I am not pulling them out of thin air. I have a lot of bibliography. I have interviews with specialists and everything. Please go check them. What does the person do? Do they do that? No. They just go on and write a comment ignoring the sources that I provided. Because to those people, it is not about having an honest conversation. It's about looking like they are the smart person in the room. For me, the line that says it all about the psychology of those people is this person saying, I always side-eye those people who present historical reconstructions as perfectly accurate, but nobody does that in the field of historical musicology. So they're not actually side-eyeing people that do exist. This person is side-eyeing people that they've made up in their mind so that they can feel smarter than them and act condescending towards them. See, the big problem with these pseudo-intellectuals is that they always wear the language and the air of nuance. They always talk as if we have to be careful and we have to be nuanced. But which position sounds more absolute and which one sounds more nuanced? We know nothing about any historical music. There's no way to know. There's no way to know. We know absolutely nothing. Or there are some things we know, there are some things that we don't know, and depending on the culture, we can get a clearer or blurrier approximation. It's situational and there are no clear answers across the board. Which one is the one that deals in nuance, and which one is the one that avoids absolutes and certainties? I think the answer is very clear. This video was made for people who want to understand historical musicology, and the first step to understanding is to not make that mistake that pseudo-intellectual people do. I hope this was a worthwhile video for you guys, and I am logging off because I have a lot of other things to do. Goodbye.